Since at least the mid-1980s, it has become increasingly fashionable to refer to Roman power in the Eastern Mediterranean during the 2nd and 1st centuries BC as hegemony rather than empire. These analyses tend to start from neo-realist definitions, such as Michael Doyle's, positing hegemony as an intermediate stage between diplomacy and empire, wherein space for active negotiation between the imperial center and the periphery appears. Increasingly, social sciences are integrating Gramscian approaches to hegemony into analysis of modern international systems. And I cite here Robinson's work and Worth in the bibliography. In light of this, it is timely to ask what Gramsci's concept of hegemony can add to the conversation around Roman imperialism. This paper investigates how late Republican administrators organized power in provincial context through a case study for how Roman elites engaged with civic leaders in the province of Asia during the late Republic. It focuses on the inscription of Roman official documents, draws on Cicero's Pro Flacco in Asia to provide a snapshot of interaction between locals and Romans, and adduces evidence for local power brokers such as Theophanies of Muntellini and their engagement with Roman administrators. Overall, it will address the question of how Roman administrators engaged with and coerced local inhabitants to gain their consent for Roman rule. Consequently, this paper will demonstrate the utility of Gramsci's concept of hegemony in advancing our understanding of Roman provincial government during the late Republic. I'll begin with a brief survey of the use of the term hegemony in studies of the Roman Republic and its provinces to establish how the concept is most often deployed. The work of Arthur Eckstein and other exponents of IR theory within a Roman context has been particularly influential. Taking the concept of hegemony deployed in neo-realist IR, neatly defined here by both Doyle and Donnelly, and applying it to the ancient Mediterranean. For Doyle, hegemony was a utilitarian descriptive term, indicating a level of control exerted by one community over another, which is less than total, less than empire, that is. Specifically, it indicates a stage at which the subordinate community maintains control over its internal affairs, but is constrained to follow the dominant community's foreign policy. This distinction is significant in studying the emergence of the Roman provinces in the Eastern Mediterranean and underlies Caleb Marx's well-known 1995 monograph, Hegemony to Empire. Though a quick reread, let me note that explicit references to this distinction are surprisingly limited. This definition is now routinely employed as a shorthand in studies of the Republican provinces, and I note swiftly at the bottom of this slide a few examples, including my own work. But the fact is, hegemony in this limited sense is a useful descriptor. However, alternative, more expansive frameworks for understanding hegemony exist, and most notably that of Gramsci. Though never explicitly defined in his work, Gramsci uses the term hegemony to describe a cultural phenomenon whereby political rule is based on the consent of the populace, secured through the internalization and popularization of the worldview of the elite class. Hegemony is a dialectical relationship between the political leadership and the population at large, neither imposed by the former on the latter, nor immanent and systemic. It is a lived system responding to the interests, ideologies, actions of all participants in society. As Worth, inter alias, has argued regarding modern examples, this Gramscian schema can be usefully applied to the international system to analyze how dominant polities are configured and how they construct institutions to create transnational consent for ruling parties' ideologies and preferences. While Gramsci was responding explicitly to the failure of orthodox Marxism to explain his contemporary political landscape, his concept emphasizes a crucial point. That is to say that societies integrate individual members to the extent that their experiences are based around shared convictions. These principles form the basis of societal mores, which develop constantly in a dynamic and incremental fashion. This is a useful hermeneutic precisely because it describes a process of generating common values, albeit common values and a cohesion aligned with the views of the dominant members of a society. This application of Gramscian frameworks to the international and transnational sphere of modern IR points to the potential utility in examining the provincial experience in ancient empires, in my case, Roman Asia. This more expansive conception of hegemony can therefore enrich our understanding of the development of Republican empire as a process. Now, for the remainder of this paper, I'll analyze Asia Minor during the late Republic as a case study for applying this Gramscian lens. I'll concentrate on the post-Sulan period when most communities were directly subordinated to gubernatorial jurisdiction, though individual communities could possess a diverse patchwork of individual rights and obligations, and local government was largely in the hands of local civic institutions. There are three main topics that I'll briefly cover: inscription of Roman documents, engagement of locals with Roman jurisdiction, and engagement of individuals with Roman society as a whole. So first, civic communities had a long history of monumentalizing their own important decrees or communications with Hellenistic monarchs. This trend continued with the establishment of Roman governance. However, that is not to say that the Romans routinely required the publication, or more precisely, monumentalization of official documents. In fact, local interest often best explains the inscriptions which do survive. Without dwelling on this point, which Alison Cooley has persuasively made, one key example here would be the inscription of multiple senatus consulta, granting pre-Roman decisions standing in Roman law at an unknown city in remote Phrygia, near the modern village of Ursula. Others would include the documents referring to the achievements of Potamon of Muntellini or the so-called archive wall at Aphrodisias, and I'm more than happy to talk about any of these in the discussion. To the extent that this observation holds, communities, in choosing to expend resources on monumentally displaying Roman official documents, not only actively collaborated in their publicization, but also implicitly endorsed their contents, both textual and non-textual. There is substantial evidence for the widespread dissemination of Roman official documents from soon after the establishment of a permanent province in Asia. The so-called Lex de Provinciis Praetorius, promulgated in early 100 BC, includes a clause ordering the dissemination and publication of letters related to its contents. And we've got some text on the screen here. Specifically, after detailed instructions to the senior consul, who is to write to several allied rulers to coordinate operations against pirates, the text orders the current praetor in Asia to write to, quote, the cities and states to whom it is appropriate under the statute, end quote, requiring that, and again I quote, whatever letters he sends, that they be delivered according to the statute, and that according to the customs of those to whom they are sent, engraved on a bronze tablet, or on a marble slab, or even on a whitened board, and be openly published in the cities in a sanctuary or an agora in such a way as that people are able to read them. Now this reveals three important points. First, that it was the text of the letters that was to be displayed rather than the statute itself. Second, that the author does not explicitly require that the text be permanently recorded. The provision is made for it to be displayed on white boards, for example, though it may well have been. It was the choice of the local community. Third, and finally, that the author requires the praetor to encroach upon local public spaces and access to public documents. The implications, especially in light of the survival of this document as two copies in Delphi, outside of Asia, and Cnidus, are that the author intended for the text to be widely disseminated and displayed, and that certain communities chose to take this further and monumentalize this text. Increasingly, Roman documents were included in civic archives, displayed prominently in public spaces, and occasionally monumentalized alongside the most important pronouncements of local authorities. Over time, local inhabitants were increasingly exposed to Roman normative documents in their public spaces. Monumentalized archival material, the public presentation of civic identity and memory, now included Roman text if organized and chosen by local actors. Individuals who consciously engage with these documents, as text or otherwise, were exposed to an interplay between Roman and local systems of authority. These texts carried significant force, and by interacting with local frameworks of power, could create a sense of legitimacy around Roman ideology and state action. Now, beyond this, we have engagement of provincials with the Roman judicial system. A key element of Cicero's rhetorical strategy in his speech Pro Flecco, delivered in defense of a former governor of Asia in 59, is to establish, first, a spectrum of value in the testimony of witnesses, running from Romans through to the inhabitants of the Western provinces, to Greeks, and then finally Phrygians, Carians, and Mysians. And secondly, a distinction between the civic institutions of communities, valuing the more limited and exclusive bullae over the more comparatively inclusive ecclesia. His clear motive for doing so, that the delegations, or at least those he engages with, of witnesses, seem not to have received endorsements from the former. Indeed, Cicero explicitly contrasts his own practice as prosecutor against Gaius Verres a decade earlier with that of his opponent Decimus Laelius. At Varines 2.2.161, Cicero carefully explains that the whole community repudiated the honorific statues and embassies that they had disseminated during Verres' command. He stresses that the bullae decreed and the demos commanded that letters and ambassadors be sent to Rome to testify. However, in his defense of Flaccus, Cicero emphasizes the role played by prosecutors in encouraging these embassies, where he states that where I myself summoned witnesses from Sicily at public expense, this was evidence not from an excited public meeting, but was sworn to by the bullae. The crux of Cicero's argument is that the embassies against Flaccus are not legitimate representatives of the civic community, as they are appointed by assemblies alone without oversight. He warms to this theme when treating the specific charges leveled against Flaccus, highlighting the absence of respected, for which we may read aristocratic, voices from the delegations of Tralles and Temnus in particular. This echoes his attempt to dismiss the supporters of Verres as those in usu populi ac senatus, uncommanded by the demos and bullae. Though Cicero's ulterior motives must be acknowledged here, this does speak to a set of expectations on the part of Roman jurors. It is unclear exactly why these bullae chose not to support action, but we could posit either social pressure, lobbying by Romans, fear of losing privileges, which obviously weigh more heavily on the wealthier members of communities. The crucial point here is that they made this choice, that they consented to the praxis of Roman administration and governance to their own benefit and possibly to the detriment of their community. The corollary is also true, however. The role of the prosecutor in encouraging communities to make a complaint and supporting witnesses in Rome points to the frequent phenomenon of provincials becoming involved in legal action against former governors. And we can bring in here Cicero's own concerns regarding his brother Quintus's governorship. Even where, taking Cicero as word, the prosecutor was the initiator, and more pragmatic provincials refused to endorse this action, we see popular assemblies both engaging constructively with and consenting to Roman forms of justice, inadequate as they may have been. Notwithstanding that this took place in a context where violent repudiation was not a viable alternative, and indeed had just been recently quashed during the First Mithridatic War, an active choice on the part of the community to spend resources on embassies and witnesses can be seen as buying into the Roman administrative process. Taken together, this evidence viewed through the lens of Gramscian hegemony illustrates the interconnection between consent of local agents and establishing and bolstering Roman governance in Asia. Now, a crucial element of the growing importance of civic embassies during this period was the increasing prominence of personal connections for informing Roman attitudes towards provincial communities. Particularly notable here are the arguments employed by Cicero in the Pro Flecco against the testimony of certain representatives. On several occasions, he explicitly emphasizes that a witness is unknown to the Roman jury. And there are a series of examples on the slide. For example, that villager from Tmolus, unknown to his own neighbor, as he memorably dismisses one individual. Now, significantly, Cicero also takes a reverse approach, questioning at 45, if the most distinguished men in the city have been unfairly treated, then why were they not present? He riffs on this theme at length in chapters 52 and 53. naming 6 Trallians from whom he would have accepted evidence, while attacking the character of the leader of the Trallian delegation, one Meandrius, as untrustworthy, vile, and loathsome Lewis Egens and Inquinatius. This demonstrates the point that Cicero, and perhaps by extension his audience, were familiar with a number of influential individuals in provincial communities and could argue plausibly that certain actors were more or less aligned with Roman values surrounding evidence. Though these informal contacts did not represent public or necessarily officially sanctioned exchanges, they could have significant effects on the well-being of communities. They also illustrate neatly the phenomenon of individuals engaging with and buying into the hegemonic discourse. Perhaps the most notable example of a provincial using his personal Roman connections to benefit his home city is Theophanies of Muntellini. A well-known intellectual, he accompanied Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus on his eastern campaigns after 67, of which he produced a history. He is attested, unusually for this period, as a Roman citizen in 62, taking the name Gnaeus Pompeius Theophanes. The ambiguity over whether individuals could hold a non-Roman citizenship alongside the civitas Romana has important implications for his social status. While Greek self-identity in this period was based on language and shared culture, the Roman ideal focused more closely on participation within the citizen community. As Federico Santangelo has recently demonstrated, after 62, the evidence places him either at Rome or in the vicinity of Pompeius, speaking to his close attention to Roman political games and his importance as a social actor at Rome. Accordingly, we could see Theophanes as indicative of a phenomenon wherein, during the mid-1st century, ambition was relocated from the civic to the imperial sphere for select allied individuals. Direct personal relationships with Romans could even secure honor and privileges beyond those offered by service within their own community. Theophanes was honored in extraordinary, if broadly traditional terms, as a civic benefactor, having persuaded Pompeius to restore freedom to Muntellini. However, Santangelo's persuasive argument that the bulk of Theophanes' utility to Pompeius was in a Roman political mode rather than in his literary output complicates that account of his assistance. As a Roman citizen living and operating at Rome, Theophanes, in a practical sense, stood outside of this Mytilenian community. Yet, as monumental honors in Mytilene reinforce, he commanded reverence and respect from his home polis. Such dual roles become increasingly visible during the 40s and 30s, and perhaps the most explicit example is the father and son Theopompus and Artemiodorus of Cnidus. The literary sources emphasize that Gaius Julius Caesar made Cnidus a free city to gratify Theopompus, memorably dismissed by Plutarch as a collector of stories. Meanwhile, Plutarch notes that Artemiodorus, being socially connected to friends of Marcus Brutus, sought to warn Caesar ahead of his assassination. The parallels between Theopompus and Artemiodorus on the one hand and Theophanes are strong. They're members of the provincial elite in Asia, plucked from the literati, and connected to powerful Romans who then arranged for their polis to receive freedom. Theopompus' citizenship is well attested, and like Theophanes, the sources imply that he was more active at Rome than in Asia. While Theopompus and his son may have been a major factor in Cnidus' freedom, and we know from epigraphic evidence were present at the oaths for the treaty between Rome and Cnidus, they were explicitly not part of the embassy to Caesar. The crucial point to emphasize here is that these individuals, specifically honored by their local communities in traditional terms for their benefactions, were choosing to engage with Roman social and cultural practices, buying into and actively consenting to Roman hegemony. Gramsci's particular framing has much to offer then in interpreting this phenomenon. So to wrap up, I'm not arguing here that we should no longer use the term hegemony in a descriptive sense. However, as I hope to have shown, actively co-opting Gramsci's concept enriches our models and understanding of developments in the Roman provinces. To relate this to the theme of the conference, focusing on the establishment of consent, particularly among local elites, through coercion and the popularization of Roman values and practice as a living system, offers a holistic approach to understanding Roman Empire. I should also note that there is much more that can be said about each of the topics which I really briefly touched on today. Nevertheless, my exceedingly brief case study of Asia reveals three specific ways in which subordinate communities and their inhabitants collaborated in constructing a hegemonic discourse which came to imbricate them within an imperial culture and society. First, communities chose to monumentalize Roman official decisions, placing them on a par with the highest local and earlier imperial authorities. Second, communities consented to and implicitly endorsed Roman justice through participation in legal processes. Third, individual actors chose to actively engage with Roman social and political cultures. In these ways, elite actors in local communities engaged with, co-opted, and bought into Roman practice. Independently, none of these observations are especially novel. However, the explanatory power of Gramsci's concept of hegemony allows us to link them into a single lived system and can offer a startling insight into the emergence of Roman Empire during the late Republic. Thank you very much.